Well, here we are again. It's Sunday, December 8th, 2024, around 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. You're watching Co-op for Two. Today we are completing The Case of the Poisoned Pen, a Dear Holmes case that we've been playing for the last month. Today we'll be reading the solution from the person who calls himself Sherlock Holmes. But before we get into that, let's do a little bit of bookkeeping, check in with the chat, make sure everything is copacetic, that we're actually broadcasting. I've got my decaf coffee. I'm a little bit twitchy today. Okay, a couple of things to talk about. I've spent the last week recording some overdue videos, catching up on my reviews. I've recorded and edited 12 short reviews that are going live every couple days. There are 4 that were up already as of today. One for Guilty Monaco 1955, a review of 50 Clues, a review of Backstories Alone Under the Ice, and a review of the newest Cryptic Killers game, Murder on Mount Mortimer, all of which we played recently. The last review I recorded was for Time Stories Revolution series, which was... there was a lot there to talk about. That review is over an hour long. The rest of the reviews are quite short. And then, probably of more interest, I recorded today my holiday gift guide for tabletop mystery games, in which I crammed a recommendation of about 70 games in 24 categories in 30 minutes. So that'll be an interesting whirlwind set of recommendations if anyone's looking for a game to purchase for themselves or for someone else. Check that out. That should be up tonight. All right. Now, what else do we need to talk about? I've got an exciting announcement. For those of you who have been playing these play-by-mail games with me for a while, you will remember that last year, about 13 months ago, almost exactly a year ago, a viewer of the channel, Matt C., created something very special for us. He basically wrote a bespoke, improvised Sherlock Holmes case, a mail-based case. So we got the first letter, we read it, we talked about it, and we wrote a reply to Watson, suggestions for what we wanted him to investigate. And then Matt wrote the second letter based on that. So it was a one-off, custom, play-by-mail, letter-based case that was written for us. It was a very special experience, one of the highlights of the last 4 years on this channel. You can watch those playthroughs. It took us about, I think maybe about a month and a half to play. So Matt has agreed to make a new case for us, a new improvised play-by-mail case that we will start playing next week. The other twist there is that he is writing it using the New York noir world and directories and maps. Now, this is a very ambitious experiment, and what I told Matt is the same thing I told him last time, which is you're in completely uncharted territory here. No one knows how to do this or how it will work or what will happen. And especially with New York noir world, which is totally alien to Matt, but also the whole thing is alien. So we're not hoping for a masterpiece. We're just going to see if the wheels stay on the cart. This will be a case set in New York City and Manhattan in 1929 in the financial district. Matt has written the first letter. Debbie is going to help do some editing, which she did last year as well. It is very exciting. If you enjoy Dear Holmes, this is on a whole other level. And yeah, so we'll read a letter, but then we'll discuss what to do. We'll have to make real decisions, advice, requests. I have no idea who's going to be writing us. I don't know anything about the case, but I am very interested in it. Now, the last little piece of that is that means you have a week to play New York Noir and consider downloading and playing the demo case that I recently wrote. I've written 2 cases for New York Noir. Rocky Helton has written a case. Water wrote a case. Water or Dysphamonite? I can't. Water. Anyway, but I wrote a big, long, difficult case, but I very recently written a short demo case meant to teach you the system and set you in this world of New York City in the 30s. So if you've got some time, I would love to have a little bit more feedback on that demo case. It's all playable on a tablet. It's just downloadable PDFs. You'll find a link to that if you visit the Board Game Geek page for New York Noir. There's a link to the demo case, or you could stop by our Discord. All right, exciting. That'll be next week. It'll be at our regular 1 p.m. Sunday mail slot. Okay, anything else to talk about? I guess the only other thing is that now that I'm all cut up and we're soon entering the middle of December when I will have lots of time to do some live streaming. So I expect we'll be playing a bunch of games live on the channel for the 2 or 3 weeks starting next week. One of the games we have scheduled tentatively is Razorhurst Blood Alley, John Keen's free print and play game. That'll be an epic experience, and the plan is to play that in the week between Christmas and New Year. So that's another sort of special event here on the channel. Very exciting. But there'll be other games that we'll be playing as well. I'll try to sprinkle them in on different schedules. There's a whole bunch of games I want to get to. Some Masters of Crime game, another Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective fan case. Matt says, will it spoil the first Razorhurst? That's a good question. I don't believe so, but I will ask John Keen so that I have that answer for us before we play it. So yeah, I am so happy to have this channel and to be able to share it with you guys and share the time with you. I'm just couldn't be happier. Couldn't be happier. All right. Well, let's get to our Dear Holmes case. Last week, I did a very long recap. So even though it's my nature to do those long recaps, I think probably it would be a bad idea to do it all over again this week. So I'm not going to recap the entire case. You remember, though, of course, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, don't watch this one. It won't make any sense. You can leave now and go watch that. But our case is basically Froggy Fletcher, who's pursuing the girl of his dreams, Henny Arden, the farmer's daughter, and an anonymous letter was sent to the father of this woman saying that our Froggy Fletcher was a thief and telling him about when he was accused of robbing from school funds as a kid. He's asked Sherlock Holmes to come in and vouch for him and prove that someone else is making up these lies about him because he was cleared. And we've got a couple of suspects. We've got 3 potential suitors who are suspects. And then there's been some other ideas floated around. Now, I feel like we have a fairly confident opinion, consensus of who the culprit is. And let's look at the last letter we got this last week, which seemed to cement it all for us. So the one other suitor who was so happy last week was Robert Bonner. This is the neighbor's boy who's been courting our girl, and he seems to think he's got it all locked up when Froggy, our guy, was on the outs. And now we ask about Gray, who was one of the other suitors, who's always seems to be more interested in the mother than in Henny. Well, we learn why. It's because Gray isn't really a suitor of Henny. He's a railroad guy, and he's been trying to convince the mother and the family to sell their farm, lease it to the railroad, and they're going to get rich on this. So that gets rid of Gray. He's got no motive to pass bad news about our guy, Froggy Fletcher. And we get this very nice letter. Actually, the last letter was very sweet. It was sort of a love affair when he's reuniting with her. He's convinced the father that he really didn't steal any money, so he's back in with the girl. They have a very touching scene, but this letter is just them getting back together and also her filling him in on what's going on with the other suitors. And what we learn is that Robert, the neighbor's boy, and the mother both hired private investigators to snoop on the other suitors. The mother hired them to check out the railroad guy, and it seems implicit that she probably hired someone to check on all the suitors because she doesn't want her daughter marrying a ne'er-do-well. So when Robert finds out there was some private eye hired, he says, that's a great idea. I'm going to hire my own private eye to check on the other suitors. And then we hear about Gray being a railroad guy. This is the hiring of the suitors. And then Robert Bonner is making weird comments, like you only have two options left. He thinks it's just down to him. He's trying to get rid of it. She says, I don't know what he told his parents. I told him that I'll think about his proposal, but she thinks Robert told his parents it's a lock. Then there's more discussion. This is more flirting between the two of them. And then, so she doesn't tell us much about the other suitor, which is the newspaper guy, Dempwolf, that we're a little bit suspicious about. But we do hear a little bit about Dempwolf when we get another scene in the furniture shop that our guy Froggy Fletcher keeps delivering furniture to. And the guy who works there says, hey, I recognized that other guy you mentioned, Dempwolf. He's a famous writer you happen to know. I didn't realize you knew such important people. And we get this weird comment about the furniture guy missing a left index finger. It's a little suspicion. And then Froggy is talking to Sherlock Holmes and says, I did some of the things I'm replying to your questions. First of all, no one knows my maiden name, except the people I do business with for farming. And he says, let me tell you a little bit more about the homestead. He says, the Ardens are right next door. Basically, their porches are almost touching the Bonners. And in fact, the two families go in between houses very often. And this was actually picked up as a nice subtle bit of detective work, which is we're told, well, let me finish here and then I'll come back to where we get our evidence. Then we're told that if the railroad comes, there might be an issue with the Bonners, the neighbors, feeling like they could get squeezed out because they depend on Henny's family's farm for water rights, which they don't have a strict contract on. And then we hear that Dempwolf, the newspaper reporter, and Bonner are very good friends. He doesn't know how they met or how long or what they talk about, but they're obviously very good friends. Then he confirms only the close people who know her call her Henny. And then he talks a little bit about the father, Bonner, Manfred, and his language, being these here parts he referenced. So that was our last letter. Now let me point out a couple things that stood out to us. The first question that we sort of lingered on for a while is, how does this anonymous letter repeating the claims against Froggy Fletcher get to this house, get to the Arden house? We're told that it was dropped off under the door or something. No one saw who did it. And we're told in this letter and in other letters that, like, because they live so up on a hill with servants, like if anyone comes near the farm, they're noticed by everyone. So we were wondering who could have dropped off this letter. Did one of the visitors drop it while they were there? There was some talk. Could it be the mother? Like, is the mother leaving this letter? We had some reasons. I don't think it. I think my point was that the mother is too strong-willed. She just would have said, nope, you're not marrying him if she didn't like him. She wouldn't have had to concoct this letter. But one of the observations in the channel was that this is how the letter got dropped off. We're told there's basically only one family, one group of people that are so close and spend so much time in the house that they could have dropped this anonymous letter, and that's the Bonners. More confirmation in our theory that it's Robert Bonner and his father who have orchestrated this anonymous letter to get rid of one of their competing suitors, our guy, Froggy Fletcher. This part about who calls her Henny, we know the anonymous letter referred to Henny. So the question is, who would have called her Henny? And we're told that Dempwolf wouldn't. He calls her Hendrika. And then, so there's that. And then here, this language from the father, Bonner, matches a little bit of language that we saw in our letter. These here parts, sort of slang, cowboy western. So everything seems to point to the next door neighbors, the Bonners. Both the motives, this now really we see how important the marriage is for them. They need to marry into these neighbors' farms, otherwise they're in real risk. The language that they use, the opportunity to be next door and drop off the letter. The only thing that I think we're still a little bit unsure about is whether Dempwolf, the newspaper guy, is helping Bonner. And we're told by Henny that she doesn't think Robert really loves her. He loves someone or something. He wants to please his parents. So there's some discussion of, is there some homosexual relationship with Robert Bonner and Dempwolf? Even if not, is Dempwolf the ambitious newspaper guy? Is he the private detective that Bonner has hired to dig into this? And even if not, is the big story that Dempwolf, the newspaper guy, is working on, is it involving our guy Froggy Fletcher or the railroad or both? It does seem like Robert Bonner is not really in a position to discover Froggy's past, but I think Dempwolf, the newspaper guy, could have. But also we're told that Robert hired a PI, and it's not that hard to believe that a private investigator could dig it up. So before we read that catches us up. Now, before we read the solution, does anyone want to get on the record with their theories here? Does anyone disagree that it's the Bonners? Does someone have a more specific breakdown of the father's role and the son's role? Is it possible that the son doesn't even know that the father wrote this letter? We are told that Robert Bonner, the son, who's the suitor of Henny, hasn't told Henny anything about knowing anything about Fletcher's past, which is a little odd. That would be a hard secret to keep. Macon Leary says, Dempwolf, the newspaper guy, is definitely helping, and both Bonners are guilty. Rob says it's the father, the son doesn't know. So I guess the big questions for you to answer is it the Bonners? Which of the Bonners? What role did they play? And then what role did Dempwolf play in all this? Those are your three questions. DJ Moneycut says, I want it to be the mother, but I think it's Bonner Sr. with the help of Dempwolf. Marlene thinks one of our original theories that Dempwolf really is from Froggy's hometown. There was some mention in the early letters whether Dempwolf looked a little familiar to Froggy Fletcher. That feels like a little bit of a coincidence to me. It will be interesting. The game is there's clear in this letter this little bit of trying to tease the idea that the furniture store guy is somehow involved with his missing index finger. But it doesn't sound like any of us are biting on that. But Marlene does think there is a tie-in with his old town. I don't think so. I think the anonymous letter matched exactly the newspaper story, including the missing details. So that, to me, is the clue that whoever's discovered this story is not someone from Froggy Fletcher's past. He's just someone who's dug up the newspaper. Pettiol says, I'm with Rob. Son seems out of the loop. Debbie says, I think it's the father, possibly with his son's help. Not sure about Dempwolf. I think it's more likely Dempwolf was looking into the railroad business as lead for a story. I think Marlene says the original story was from across the ocean. Yes, it was, but I'm just saying, like, I don't think we need the Dempwolf to be from Froggy's past to have access to the paper. Okay, so let me give you my answer to those questions. I think that Dempwolf is not helping Bonner. I think Dempwolf is just working on the railroad story. Although there is mention that he was working on a 10-year-old story that was important, but that's going to be my guess. My guess is that Dempwolf is not the one who discovered Froggy Fletcher's past. He's just trying to crack the railroad story. And I'm going to say that the son, Bonner, the neighbor's son, is not involved in planting the letter, sort of doesn't know. I'm going to guess it's all the father and maybe the mother, but I'm going to guess I definitely think it's the Bonners, but I'm going to guess that the son is not involved. I wouldn't swear on that. I wouldn't put odds on it, but that if I had to guess, that's what I would guess. I would guess that the fact that Robert Bonner, the son, would have a hard time keeping that a secret and not talking about it. I don't think there's any reason he needs to know. Debbie says, if neither Dempwolf nor Robert is involved, where did the father get the info? That is a good point. We are told that the son hired a PI, but I wonder. I guess my conclusion would be to assume that the father actually hired the PI. And that's how they got the information. I do think it was the private investigator hired by the Bonners who dug up Froggy's past. But if we take the game at its word, if we take Robert Bonner at his word that he hired the PI, then he would have to be involved. What exactly does it say? So let's just take a look at who hired the PI. Robert, he's a jealous sort. You know, he spotted the detective hanging around and confronted him. Robert put two and two together and came up with 5. He thought Mom had hired a private detective to do some digging into Gray as my potential husband. So tit for tat, he hired a detective to do the same. So according to Henny, it was the son that hired the PI. So if you follow that, then the son has to be in, and it is the PI who dug up Froggy Fletcher's past, then it would be natural to assume that the son knows about it. It's weird. We don't know too much about Robert's personality, although she does talk about it a little bit more. I told him the same as every other time, but I don't know what he's told his parents. Did he say anything about me? He asks Henny. She says, like what? What would he say? When I saw his father at the bank, he sounded as though he was convinced I was out of favor. And she says, well, that's not odd. Everyone knew you were out of favor. But Robert hasn't thought to tell me anything. So he didn't. It's kind of odd. Robert has only ever wanted to please his parents. And she says, I do love him, but I'm starting to realize I think of him as I would a brother. Besides, when I marry, I'm marrying for love. This very touching scene, very sweet scene where the two of them are flirting with each other. Marlene says there wasn't even a name in the paper. He would have to figure it out, word of mouth. I do think he just dug it up, investigated people who knew him and dug it up. Okay. Didn't the father mention the dog had been useful at last? This made me believe someone had helped them, Dempwolf. That's interesting. I don't remember that quote, the dog had been useful at last. That would be very useful to know if you could find that. Rob says, I'm prepared to be disappointed with the solution regarding how he got the blackmail. Debbie says, same, I'm used to disappointing solutions by now. Maybe it will turn out it is the furniture guy wanting revenge for his last finger. All right, well, let's go ahead and read the solution. All right, here we go. Joe J. Anderson says, I think he mentioned the dog when he visited Froggy at the bank. Well, okay. I know what you're talking about. He's talking about his son. He wasn't talking about Dempwolf, I think. What he said was, he said, the father Bonner was basically talking about how his son is going to marry Henny. And he basically says, I was beginning to think that dog wouldn't hunt, but it looks like he did. So I think he's talking about his son hunting a wife. We'll find out. And then we'll rank this with our other cases. All right, here we go. From the desk of Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London, England, 13 February 1888. My dear Froggy, thank you for remembering me so fondly, and even more so for bringing your singular case to my attention. With your recent letter in hand, I'm pleased to say that all the pieces are now on the board. I've unearthed the truth behind this mysterious assault on your character. If I may, I will explain how I arrived at my conclusion, first by outlining the salient points of the case. At its core, the letter you first wrote to me concerned your relationship with Miss Hendrika Arden, who does indeed sound like a most remarkable young lady. Miss Arden has had 3 other suitors for some time now, one of whom you believed sought to ruin you by means of a defamatory letter. You quite naturally believed that the reason for this hinged on the young lady's affections. The 3 other suitors were Clarence Gray, Carl Dempwolf, and Robert Bonner. From the start, you noted that Gray appeared to have more interest in Madame Arden than her daughter, and Henny herself rarely mentioned him. With his profession and links to the railroad, it appeared to me that he could be a stalking horse, and so he has proved to be. Dempwolf, for all of his fancy footwork, seemed to be no suitor at all. He was rarely present, and the formal tone he used to refer to the lady is hardly lovers' talk. You later wrote that Henny laughingly said that Bonner was not concerned about Gray because he felt a fake suitor would keep the real thing at bay. Could Bonner not have used the same technique, setting his friend Dempwolf to pursue the lady to deter others? I believe so, especially as Robert Bonner is one who is more used to following than leading. Indeed, it seems that the lady has been very poorly used by those closest to her. But what of Bonner? Surely his suit is true. Alas, in this there can be no greater witness than the lady herself. As Miss Arden said, a girl can tell when she's being made love to. Robert Bonner is a dutiful son, no more, no less. While I am certainly no expert on the topic, if it pleases you to hear the opinion of a confirmed bachelor, I would say that you, my dear Froggy, are the only musketeer who truly cares for Miss Arden in the way that a potential husband should. And the lady most definitely recognizes it. By the by, my friend, you really should have paid more attention in class. The lady is quite correct. There are 4 musketeers. Putting that aside, and having eliminated our so-called suitors, the question before us becomes not one of disparate and desperate lovers, but one of who has the most to gain if Hendrika Arden marries Robert Bonner instead of Frederick Fletcher. Money is so often, if not the root of all evil, the reason that many evil deeds are done. And what we have here are 2 families who stand to make a great deal of money, if Miss Arden can be persuaded to choose the right suitor. Rest assured that fathers playing the exchanges with their daughters is nothing new. The fairer sex has been treated as capital which must be invested in the most profitable husband for centuries, and both Arden and Bonner have much to gain from, as you put it, a merger. One is near to going under, and one is in secret talks with a railroad consortium. But does Arden need to control both ranches in order to seal the deal with the railroad? It seems clear from Papa Arden's shift in partiality from you to Bonner, but never the other suitors, that he certainly thought so at one point in time. The most respectable-looking men are often called villains, and I considered for a time that Papa Arden could have fabricated the letter, perhaps based on information procured by his wife's private agent. He had, in theory, much to gain from this. He could have used the letter to ruin your chances with his daughter and push through the merger. or a darker thought surfaced, to use as leverage for his loan, or even in future business dealings should Henny choose another suitor. But he did not. Your assessment of him as one who values fair play seems accurate, for he gave you ample time to clear your name. No, it is Bonner who has the most to gain. Manfred Bonner is in debt without the independent means to pay back his loan. Should Henny and Robert marry, the Bonners would certainly benefit financially, for you don't let family fail, as you reported he said in your second letter. On the other hand, if they don't marry and the railroad gains access to the Ardens' land, then Bonner's rights to water and the free roaming of his stock could be endangered. We must remember that all this had been bubbling under for at least 2 years since Gray arrived in Baltimore. We can assume that a year ago the consortium finally raised the funds they required and began to move forwards, for that's when Gray was installed as another of Henny's suitors. In spite of Mrs. Arden's attempts to keep things quiet, it is likely that the Bonners knew some of what was taking place. They had no choice but to bide their time, however. As the months rumbled on, they became increasingly desperate. Their loan payments were due. Poor, dull old Robert had still not managed to bag himself the much-wished-for wife, and you were winning both Henny's affection and the approval of her parents. At some point, Froggy, Manfred Bonner learnt of your past. It was then that he wrote the letter. The letter itself offers a number of proofs of that. First is the wording. Examine this portion. The villain fled to these here states before he could be taken to law. You might want to think of what sort of son a man like that would make before you ruin Henny and yourself. If your report is accurate, as you say it is, then Bonner Sr. used the exact same phrase, these here, during his interview with you and on several other occasions quoted in your letters. The message was also clearly composed by someone familiar with Hendrika Arden, for only those who know and love her use the diminutive Henny. Diminutive Henny. Furthermore, a short nickname. Furthermore, it was written by someone who has done business with you and knows your full name, Frederick Hawthorne Fletcher. Then there is the tone of the missive. You see, Manfred Bonner is a man who's grown used to obedience. He expects his son to woo the lady, and he expects the lady to obey her own father in the same way. The letter is one from a father to a father. We must consider how the letter was delivered. No one saw or heard anything. It would surely be impossible for an intruder to approach the Arden homestead across winding tracks past wary animals without being heard or seen. However, a neighbor whose property abuts as Bonner's does might easily do that. The question that remains is, how did Bonner learn of your past? Given your experience as a child, you've been rightly cautious about revealing any details of your life in England, though you have admitted to sharing one important point. Whenever an account of your latest triumph emerges, my habit has been to speak in such glowing terms about you that anyone listening might imagine we were the fondest of childhood companions. Thanks to my dear friend Dr. Watson, my name is widely known, and my past, while not precisely an open book, is there for the intrepid explorer to discover. It would be but a small task to find out where I was schooled, and look there for the name of Frederick Froggy Fletcher, Hawthorne Fletcher. We know that Robert Bonner didn't take the opportunity to have his private investigator dig into your past, for he would certainly have told Henny immediately if he discovered anything that might improve his odds with the lady. So that leaves Demple, the newspaper man who spends so much of his time in the library. Yes, Carl Demple. with his extensive contacts and journalist's nose, would have been able to dig up the required information. Perhaps the decades-old story he'd found was the very same news report from our school days. The Times is known even in backwaters such as the United States. I understand. If so, then Dempwolf has presumably known since at least May of 1887, the lady's birthday, but he kept it to himself. We know this because, again, if Robert had known earlier, he would have used the information to discredit you. So why harbor the secret? He would have used the information to discredit you. So why harbor the secret? The reason was rather simple. Dempwolf possesses that old-world sense of propriety and only told his friend when he realized Bonner was in time of need. I believe he never would have done so if he had known how Bonner Sr. intended to exploit the information. I should also note that in all of these machinations, I cannot help but suspect that poor, dull old Robert is hiding his light under a bushel. Henny seems to have an especially low opinion of the poor boy. What is it she said? He thought Mama had hired a detective to do some digging into Gray as a potential husband, I suppose. So tit for tat, he hired a detective to look into Clarence. Seems more likely that Robert had intuited who Gray was and was merely researching the consortium, as Mrs. Arden had done. You yourself saw Gray making small talk with Robert Bonner often enough for it to be notable. I would not be surprised if this consortium was playing both parties until they were certain of which farm would be the greater opportunity. I hope that this letter has put your mind at rest, old friend, as to what you do with the information. Well, that's entirely up to you. However, I will make a few additional comments in the expectation that you will do the right thing. In your last letter to me, dated February the 9th, you observed that Mama Arden has a certain ruthlessness about her. She lets her husband come to the bank and appear to be making the decisions, but she will do what's needed to keep family and home afloat in these difficult times. There's little doubt in my mind that Mrs. Arden is a shrewd businesswoman. She's the planner whose foresight has kept the farm profitable when others around her failed. It may seem shocking for a woman who is perfectly at home in her neighbor's house to plot what could be their downfall, but I surmise her intentions are most aligned with her daughter's well-being, rather than her neighbor's financial success. You will find in Mrs. Arden, I think, a useful ally. With respect to the true nature of your father-in-law, pray put your mind at rest. Papa may indeed favor you for very practical reasons, but the lady's partiality is there for all to see. Besides, the interview at the bank, which appeared so alarming, was but a test, I'm quite sure. You yourself mentioned that Arden appraised you like a man buying a steer. Seems that he found you quite sound, for almost immediately after he surrendered the defamatory letter to you so that you could prove your innocence. I will also remind you that, just as the Ardens are fighting to protect their futures, Manfred Bonner is also fighting for his property and for his family's survival. Should you have the opportunity to help the Bonners rather than penalize them for errors in judgment, I would think no less of you. Quite the opposite. The West may no longer be as wild as the dime novels suggest, but good neighbors are not to be squandered lightly. With fondest regards, your friend, Sherlock Holmes. All right, so it was Dempwolf, as some in the chat guessed. Dempwolf is the person who provided the information. No real explanation of why a private eye couldn't do it. Petiol says, I like the touch of the father testing Froggy. Yeah, that was a cool little observation. It feels like all of the deductions here by Sherlock Holmes were easy for him, but that was actually a subtle little point that he concluded that the father really wasn't trying to blackmail him or threaten him for a loan, but was testing him. All right. So I also like the little touch about Sherlock Holmes saying, I think you're maybe underestimating Robert Bonner, and he might be smarter than he looks. All right, so let's talk about where this case fits. Debbie says, I don't like this case much. It seemed very superficial, for want of a better word. The letter was exactly what Fletcher thought it was, and the obvious suspect was guilty, and the stakes felt very low. Was there even a crime here? I guess not a legal crime, maybe, except for slander. Rob says, as reasonable as an explanation as could be expected, the way Froggy mentioned of being a classmate of Holmes being used to track down his school was also good. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it was really needed, but you're right. It was an interesting point that he's like, well, you keep mentioning me and going to school with me, so someone could have figured out what school you're at. Georgie Anderson says, this was my least favorite Dear Holmes of all I have played. I never found it very engaging. Well, I guess I have a slightly, Debbie says the same. I have a slightly different take. I agree that this may have been my least favorite only because it was too straightforward. It was an easy case. Like the language matching up with the letters, it was the most obvious person, and we just got more and more confirmation about that. But I think if you look at these cases, maybe there are three components to them being enjoyable. One is the core mystery and deduction and how tricky that is. And I think we're all properly saying this was too easy for us. But there are other two aspects of these cases. One is just the writing and the nature of the case and stuff. And I found this compelling. I did think it was an interesting case. This idea of someone asking for Holmes to help because one of the possible suitors is trying to sabotage him. And I liked the setting of the Old West and the hardscrabble families and that whole issue there. And I would say also the writing. There are a couple of really compelling scenes. The scene in the bank where he's asking for the loan, but the scene last week when he's reunited with Henny, that was a very touching, deftly written long scene that comprised the last letter. So I really, and it was sweet. It was very sweet. So I would say the writing and the story and the setting was very good. I very much enjoyed it. I just think it was too easy for us. It was a little too obvious that it was all along that one person. Although having said that, we weren't sure about Dempwolf's role or the father and son role. But I don't think the game explanation, I don't think Holmes's explanation really would give us any reason. He didn't give us insights into why he concluded the son was involved, not the father, vice versa. And then there was the issue about whether we were so convinced that surely he's not being blackmailed. Surely this letter is not about him possibly stealing 3 pounds as a kid, and it really was. So I think that was a sign right from the start that things were what they appeared on their face. The mystery writing clues were pretty good, but I just never cared about Froggy and his problems. I would rate it around the middle of the pack. Rob says, I don't mind it. It's one of the better ones for me. Yeah, it was pretty basic, but at least it was vague enough to generate some interesting discussion, and the solution makes sense. Melissa says, it just gives off small town gossip without much caring for anyone involved, although the letter really should have named the school. I think oh yeah, that's a good point. That with this explanation, the person writing the letter would have known the name of the school. And one of the reasons I claimed that the culprit just found the newspaper article and didn't know about his past is because otherwise they would have mentioned the name of the school. That's a very clever observant point from Macon Leary. Feels like they were trying to throw out a few red herrings to complicate things, but none of them worked. Solution was too obvious. As for being low stakes, it's a refreshing change from the standard murder plot, and I like that. I think I'm kind of with Rob on this one. I do think most of the time it's better if there's a high stakes case, but this was kind of a fun one. Petiel says, I'm in the camp of liking the overall story and I don't mind the low stakes. It's very straightforward, but I don't care. I don't know that I mind that either. I wouldn't want many cases this easy, but it's fine every once in a while. I think that's a fair statement. All right. I think I still would put this near the bottom, but boy, did I love that scene when he's reunited with her, getting back together. It was a very sweet scene. I'm a sucker for that stuff. Okay. Anything else to talk about before we wrap this up here? Anyone have any plans for Christmas? Any gifts that they have gotten for themselves? Keep an eye open for my gift guide video that will be available tonight on the channel. YouTube says 15 concurrent viewers. Marlene says, I'm excited about next week when we do the improv New York Noir mystery case. If you want homework for that case, check out my demo case for New York Noir. You can download the directories and stuff, although I've been recently redoing the directories, but that's not important for the next case. And maybe you could go watch a film noir movie. Maybe Rebecca or Double Indemnity or The Maltese Falcon. You could even try watching Akira Kurosawa's High and Low, one of my favorite movies. I had an idea a couple days ago for a great case for New York Noir that I'm sketching out now. I'm very excited about it. Debbie's going to help Matt do some editing. All right, so we'll be getting together for some more live streams in the coming weeks. We've got our Razorhurst Blood Alley Marathon, but we'll try to sneak in some other ones as well. Okay, that'll do it. I'll see you guys next time.